Yeah, this is a quick response back to Fred, who now has responded to my earlier video about some of these questions on locating what's inside or outside of space and time, and is consciousness inside space or time, or space and time inside consciousness. I guess from the most recent video with Fred, I agree, I think, wholeheartedly with what he was saying. I think even as I was shooting my last video, sort of looming largely in the back of my mind was Lakoff and Johnson's work on ontological metaphors. There does seem to be spatial containment problems. That is, the metaphors of spatial containment enter in as soon as you try to treat, I guess, substances as if they were containers and processes as if they were things. And these two, I guess, aspects are very related. One way to ask the question, and I do think Fred's right on, yeah, that consciousness is not a thing, it's not a process, but I don't think that space or time are containers either. So it's the metaphors on both sides highly problematic. When we say that the universe doesn't have an outside, I think we're still imagining something like a container metaphor. But if you try it another way and say, if the universe is all inside and it doesn't have an outside, then it doesn't have an inside either. See, it doesn't make any sense to say the universe doesn't have an outside, because then it would have to at least have some kind of inside, right? And to say it doesn't have an outside is, again, it's sort of forced issue. The same with consciousness. If I say that consciousness is inside space or time, well, then consciousness would have to have an outside. It would have to have like a wall that allows its boundaries to be defined as within this thing we call space and time. But if consciousness itself doesn't have a boundary, well, then it couldn't be inside space or time. And I think, what we're looking at here isn't a fact about consciousness or a fact about space or time. We're basically, whether we realize it or not, I think we're realizing it, but that we're using metaphor in a kind of naive realist way. And I think, maybe part of the issue would be to get at how naive verbal realism just pervades everyday common sense when we try to think about these things like space, time, thought, consciousness. We end up using physical substantive metaphors, and then we sort of see the coherence that those metaphors have as if that coherence was an empirical statement or an empirical fact there in the world, and it's just really not. I think part of the issue, though, if I go back to, if I wanted to, haggle or get into a finer point of nuance, I mean, Fred, your example of, the whirlpool isn't separate from the material. It's not like there is this thing, the process is part of the materiality. Okay, I agree with all that. I think that's right-minded. But the dreamless sleep stuff, I feel like, is still kind of being skated around. That is, okay, let's try to get at some of the dreamless sleep stuff for a second. Now, I don't ever directly experience my own dreamless sleep. I don't ever directly experience it. I always experience it both as an anticipation and as something having been. So I wake up and I remember going to bed and falling asleep or trying to fall asleep, and then I cover over that gap and I say, okay, I had been dreamlessly asleep. Yeah, I remember going to bed at 10 o'clock at night. I now woke up, it's 5 a.m., and I remember some dreaming in there, but there are parts where, the time went too quickly, and I'm aware of the fact of a total lapse of consciousness. Now, there is something interesting going on. I mean, it's unlike the whirlpool example where you have physical process and then there's a whirlpool going on, and it's not like there's the water there and then it's still or whirlpooling. Consciousness is in just such a way that it's not always there in the world and then sometimes isn't in the world. That is, if anything, the world itself in its totality, and by that I mean the distances and the relations, not the stuff, but the relations between the things, those disappear, they vanish, they kind of get liquidated in the act of dreamless sleep. And I don't know if I can find a comparative phenomena to help bring out what radical lapse of world and self occurs. I mean, I think in all other examples, there's still an awake person watching those phenomena. But when you move to dreamless sleep, even some of the examples, I looked at some of the criticisms that were given, and the one statement that was given by Zarkov, which I thought was sort of interesting, when he was posting his comment on, he made this suggestion that there are basically two kinds of consciousness. What does he say? This is Zarkov here on this most recent video. And Zarkov says, well, there's actually two kinds of consciousness, or two kinds of representation. Let me see if God, there's so many comments on this. He says, this is Zarkov. There are two different space-times. There is the representation of space-time in our brains, and then there is the real space-time that we live in and think in and experience in which is relativistic quantum, and in which your thoughts and experiences happen. You can't really experience the real space-time like you can't see the way your computer screen is making this image you are reading. And it's an insightful comment, but another part, and again, I don't disagree with that. Another part of me sees a kind of representationalism problem there. That to say that there is a space-time there, and then your brain is representing it at its own level. I mean, not only do I find that to be, again, there's insightfulness there, but there's problems with that. There's not only the problem of where will we put this third space then of geometric figures, two-dimensional figures, mathematical objects, but that's a whole different issue. Of that, is that a third space-time that doesn't fit into either of those other ones? Or now, if you're going to say, okay, well, that's just in the brain representational one, well, then I'm still stuck with the one that's there, that's I'm actually, my body's living through, that I can't directly experience, and that's quantum. I guess the problem is how is that being known to people except by various awake means? That is, there's some awake consciousness that's differentiating between those. And it's sort of like the infinite regress whenever you talk about a brain state. I mean, whoever's brain state you're looking at, you have some other person who's looking at that brain state whose brain state isn't under analysis. And I guess it washes out. I don't think it becomes a deep philosophical problem. I think we end up going, yes, we're going to have machines that in some way try to represent the world. The issue, though, is will those machines understand what time is? See, part of me wants to say they won't. That what we mean by time is not something that's just represented. See, I've tried to get at this in many videos. I feel like Zarkov is sort of suggesting that time is a thing that's out there, that is what it is, or it's somehow caught with space, that space-time is this kind of thing. And again, because we can't understand it, we give this kind of reality to it. But if part of the reason we can't understand it is because it can't be what it is without consciousness participating in it, well, then there really wasn't some thing there being represented by a brain state. It seems to be more complex, and it may be more interdependent upon the brain and the perspective of the person in order to have that temporal bearing that it does. At any rate, enjoy that response, and I hope people are enjoying this haggle about consciousness and metaphors for space, time, and containment. Okay, thanks.